Between the 1840s and the 1920s, people were going through some spiritual and emotional trauma like never before. Thanks to the new medium of photography, many families during the American Civil War had seen their men go off and never return, and now they had images of the battlefield that showed that their loved ones not only died, but died terrible, senseless deaths. Then World War I came, and there was more death, destruction, and sorrow. The rise of spiritualism during these decades promised the ability to communicate with people's dead loved ones. Not only could people who called themselves spirit mediums communicate with the dead, but they believed anyone could through studying enough techniques and practice. Seances became popular during this time, where a spirit medium tries to contact the spirit world and transmit messages from the afterlife to the living and vice versa. In this environment, the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg and the teachings of Franz Mesmer provided an example for those seeking direct personal knowledge of the afterlife. Swedenborg, for his part, claimed that he could communicate with spirits while he was awake and described the structure of the spirit world in regards to like heaven, hell, different levels and such. He said that there was not a single hell or heaven, but, a series of higher or lower ones, and that resonated with people who were into spiritualism. And he also taught that God would use humans as a means of communication from the spirit world to the living. It's okay if this doesn't make sense. It's baloney, but this is what people were into, and they were latched onto that like, oh yes, I can communicate. I've suffered this tremendous loss, but I can receive messages from them, either myself or through a spirit medium, and I can send messages to them that they are loved and they are missed. Swedenborg himself did warn against people seeking out spirit contact, but of course, people still did it anyway. Why he thought it was safe for him and not for other people, I don't know. Maybe he didn't want them to find out that it didn't work. Squeaky chair. And then Franz Mesmer, you may recognize his last name from the word mesmerize. He was the founder of hypnotism, and he claimed it could induce trances and make ordinary people able to speak to supernatural beings. There was a great deal of showmanship involved in displays of mesmerism, as you have probably seen if you've ever been to a hypnotism show, where, they make the person go into a trance and then they cluck like a chicken or say crazy things or do something they wouldn't ordinarily do on stage in front of strangers. Same thing, showmanship. It puts the butts in the seats. Because they wanted to entertain their audiences, these people who did hypnotism, and you can't keep an audience and keep people coming back if you're not entertaining them at the same time. Now, it wasn't only your average citizen in mourning who sought the services of spirit mediums and their seances and other communication methods. Famously, Mary Todd Lincoln, wife of Abraham Lincoln, would have seances in the White House due to her grieving the loss of her son, Edward. And Abe Lincoln himself would be there too, so he would participate in it as well. Of course, with anything that has a financial aspect, and it did, this did, they were not performing seances for people for free, there's a chance to manipulate people. And the spiritualist movement attracted a lot of scammers. And you might say they're all scammers because this isn't a thing you can do. But there's the true believers, and then there's the people that don't believe at all, but they're in it for the money. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about not necessarily individual ones. We can do that in another video. But right now, I want to tell you about some of the tricks of their trade that they got very good at to become famous in their field and bring in more people, which brought in more money, and fool grieving people that were seeking contact, an impossible contact with their lost loved ones. And some of the tricks they did to convince these people that they were actually communicating with the spirit world. So let's get started. Spirit rapping is not really as fun as it sounds, because back then what it meant was communication with the spirit world, where you would use knocks on floors, furniture, walls to communicate with them. Mostly they would ask questions of this spirit, and they would get their answer through a series of knocks, like 1 for yes, 2 for no, something like that. Or they could get them to, they devised ways where the spirits could spell things out by knocking. And the most famous practitioners of this spirit rapping were undoubtedly the Fox sisters. They were world renowned, and they made their fortune through a complicated set of rapping techniques. Again, imagine if it was rapping the way we think of the word rapping today. That would be these Victorian women, just 3 sisters just rapping, and people were like going crazy around the world. That would be much better than this. Much better. But no, they were knocking on things, and they had a series of complicated techniques to do this. These sisters, Kate, Maggie, and Leah Fox, would perform seances in a room of their house in Hydesville, New York, and they had set up a system of apples. Use what you got. They set up a system of apples tied to strings to make thumping sounds on the floor, ceiling, and walls. And then eventually they started popping their own joints to make the sounds, which, just keep using the apples. That could not have been good for you, for them. They were at the forefront of this spiritualist movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. They were popular for decades, and their movement had about 8 million Americans who considered themselves believers. Eventually, their scam fell apart because the sisters started to argue with each other. One of them denounced the entire movement and staged a performance where she revealed their tricks with the apples, and blamed Leah for convincing them to carry on with this scam throughout the years. But of course, the Fox sisters weren't the only people who used this. It was just one of many methods of supposedly communicating with the spirit world. The popularness of spiritualism rose with the use of photography, and mediums latched onto this right away to prove their connection to the paranormal world. And the photography would catch levitating tables, which we'll get into later, ectoplasm, again, we'll get into that later, and ghosts, which a guy in a sheet in the dark, okay? That's basically what that's going to be. A lot of people, though, were aware of photography, but they didn't really understand how it all worked, like all the scientific details, and they didn't really understand that manipulating photographs, ye old Photoshop, was even possible. They just took it for what it is. You took a picture, that's what's on the picture, that is definitely real, because you took a picture, right? This gave scammers an advantage when it came to fabricating spirit photographs. Photographers would use double exposure to make a ghostly image appear in a photograph. They could cut and reassemble negatives to form an entirely new image, complete with disembodied heads and figures ghostily appearing behind, next to, wherever. They also would get photographs of this person's dead loved one that they had been trying to communicate with and work that into the photo, placing them beside them or watching over them or whatever. People went nuts for this. So moving on to levitating tables. One trick that the mediums would use, the table would move around, and I'm pretty sure this has been in a few spooky movies where stuff does move around. I know chairs get moved around in Poltergeist and such. It's that, but it's like just the table, because that was all they needed to really impress the crap out of the Victorian people who went to these seances, okay? That's all they needed to do. They could probably make other things levitate too, but really the table was, woo, it's really happening. The spirits are here. They're shaking stuff around. And some of the tricks they would use were very simple, like using a kitchen knife, and they'd put it up their sleeve, the big poofy Victorian sleeves, and then they'd slip it into a table's drawer to lift it. And this would have to be a pretty lightweight table, but they could, make it boop, 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 boop it around, make it shudder and move in this manner. And then sometimes they built special tools that would lift tables, like they would have wrist cuffs, but with hooks concealed under those sleeves, or a hook strapped to a belt under their vest, and that would they would use that to raise the table. All they'd have to do is really maneuver their body, which they could be like, woo, the spirit's here. I wouldn't be good at this, obviously. And, they'd move and it would move the table around. And it helped, of course, that seances took place in the dark by candlelight. All of these tricks they use, dark with candlelight, helped a ton. Ectoplasm. You know what it is because you've seen Ghostbusters. And it was used back then to describe any substance that would materialize from the mouth or other parts of a medium. Yep, I know what you're thinking. Yes, also those parts. It would materialize, come out of during a seance while they were channeling a spirit. The mysterious substance was believed to take the form of the spirit the medium was channeling, and sometimes showing imagery of human forms or faces. We'll get into how they did that too. And now the way that these scammer spiritualists would fake the appearance of ectoplasm, they would tell the audience members, don't touch it, it'll kill the medium. So nobody was handling it to see what it was actually made of. And then, again, they're in the dark. And usually this ectoplasm was made of a dish rag, some cotton fabric or muslin fabric. Some even would wear like long gloves and stuff the gloves, and so it would be longer than your normal hand would be, so they could reach out and tap, give the audience members a tap, and they think, oh, there's no way the medium's human hand could reach that far. It's the spirit. I mean, some of these are kind of impressive, what they came up with. So, now as far as the ectoplasm gauzy stuff having like human faces and form, there was a medium, and probably the most famous medium, that did the ectoplasm thing, and her name was, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, so I'll put it on the screen, Marthe Berard. She would put faces in her ectoplasm because she cut them from newspapers, and she just kind of put them on there. Again, it's dark in that room, and people are primed and ready to believe. And she was exposed as a fraud, obviously. Some attendees at one of her seances noticed that some of these faces were well-known celebrities and politicians that had been in that day's paper. And then came the invention of the manifestation cabinet in the 1850s. And this worked for decades. What would happen is they would constrain the psychic medium in some way to build the trust that she wasn't doing anything to manipulate the surroundings. She wasn't faking anything. They'd tie her up with ropes or whatever, wrap her up in some way, bind her hands, whatever they needed to do to make the audience members think that she was not faking anything. And then she would go, or she would be put in this cabinet where the door was closed, and she had accomplices, of course. And they went around the staged area and the cabinet, and they would just do all kinds of paranormal happenings. They would create these paranormal happenings. They would, hands and limbs would appear. Again, it's dark in there. And they just would put on like a sheet over their hand and be like, ooh, wave it in the candlelight. And like if you were covered in black fabric, you could just like hold a violin, make it make a sound. And then people would turn to look, the people attending the seance, and there would just be the violin on a mound of black fabric. They didn't even think, hey, there's a person under that fabric who was, playing the violin a second ago. I forgot how you say it. I used to play the violin, and I forgot how you say it. Anyway. And so, of course, they open the cabinet, and there's the medium still all tied up, saying, see, I didn't do anything. Well, she didn't do anything. Her accomplices did. It worked. And a famous medium who did this was Helen Duncan. She was a Scottish woman, and she would do all these things, have all these spooky happenings, and she invited a photographer to come and see her seance and witness the manifestations in 1928. And he took flash photographs, and it turns out that these spirits floating around the room in the dark, once exposed to flash photography, they were dolls made from paper mache and draped in old sheets. So, and her ectoplasm, remember we talked about the ectoplasm coming out of everywhere, that was cheesecloth, rubber gloves, and cut out heads from magazine covers. So the invention, or not really the invention, but the widespread use of flash photography pretty much brought all these tricks down, because the lights were up and now everybody could see that it was baloney. Spirit slates were chalkboards that seance participants would use to write messages to those on the other side. The medium would hide the chalkboard in a paper bag or box, and when it was pulled back out, the original message would be replaced with a response from the spirit that they had been trying to communicate with. And how they did this was they would have 2 completely blank blackboard slates, and the trick part was to conceal an extra board that the medium had already written on before the seance started. And with sleight of hand, the concealed pre-written message would appear when the slate was pulled out of the bag, seemingly written by the spirit. Some mediums had boards with a thin wire that would go between them with a tiny nub of chalk attached. This way, they could write messages on the fly during the seance, moving the wire discreetly. And this is still a common magic trick. It's been upgraded, but I have seen magicians do this thing where they ask something or do something or pick a card, and then they reveal a thing that has the answer written on it. So this is still done, but that's where it came from. Spirit trumpets were long cones. I would think metal cones, because kind of like a megaphone, it's going to amplify sound. And they would mysteriously float around the room. Probably wires or fishing line. Remember, again, it is dark in there. There's maybe 2 candles and it is dark. All right? They would amplify the voice of spirits during a seance, because sometimes spirits aren't very loud. You got to give them some tools so they can yell at you clearer. And these were usually used at the same time as one of the manifestation cabinets that we talked about. And the trumpet would move around via a system of cords and wires operated by assistants that were, in the darkened room, probably wearing dark clothing, hiding behind curtains. They did it, okay? And the effect was a disembodied voice speaking through a trumpet that was floating around the room. I imagine it must have been a very long tube, if it was the case where the medium was in the cabinet. But, there were other ways too. They could have had someone behind a curtain with the tube to the trumpet, whispering things too. So it's not like they weren't doing this, the mediums weren't doing this alone. They had helpers who would help them fool people. And now this one, which I believe is still done in a more modern way in some magic shows. And this one even fooled Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Yeah, the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes. This one fooled him. What would happen is the medium would tell each person that was about to participate in the seance to bring a small personal object with them. And they would place these objects into a box, and the box would be locked. And then the medium would reveal what each item in the box was, down to the last detail, without ever opening the box. How this was done was trickery, of course. The audience believed they had their eyes on the box the entire time, while the medium was consulting the spirit world to reveal the items in the box. An assistant dressed as a ghost. Again, it's dark. I don't know how they dressed as a ghost. Maybe even a sheet. But they spooked around back there. And while the audience was distracted by the ghost, the assistant would switch that original box with an exact replica. Then the assistant would scurry away ghostily to another room and told the medium the description of each item through a wireless radio in the medium's ear. So this one would have been after 1896, because that's when personal wireless radios were invented. So in the later years of the spiritualism craze, I guess so many were found out as frauds that they wanted to kick it up a notch and, use the newest technology to make money. There were more methods than these. They were always coming up with something new and innovative to get money from people who were in a state of distress because of events in the world, events in their life, and events due to the loss of loved ones. So those are just some of the techniques that these spirit mediums would use to fool people during seances, aided by the lack of technology at the time, the new technology at the time, and the fact that it was darkness and candlelight. And so just want to go through some of those. Next video, we will talk about some of these famous spiritualists that were very good at conning people, and even talk about some of their debunkers and how they got debunked. And that's all I have today. Bye.